So, guys, thank you for joining us. This is Reckless VR meetup number 13. I can't believe it's number 13. We've done so much of these. It's great to see all of you. And you know, thank you for showing up every weekend. It's really awesome. If you're watching this on the live stream, then you should know that there are a few ways to join us and to get notified of future events. One is to join our Telegram group. That's at t.me/vrbitcoin, t.me/vrbitcoin. That's one way. The second way, because a lot of people were telling me that they don't like using Telegram that much. So the other way would be to use the mailing list on our website. That's recklessvr.com. You can sign up to the mailing list and get notified on everything. Or you can follow us on Twitter. That's reckless_VR. So before we continue, I just want to say a word from our sponsor, Kraken, which is supporting our weekly meetups. So Kraken is the best exchange in the world for buying and selling Bitcoin. It has the tightest security, deep liquidity, and great fee structure with no minimums or hidden fees. And whether you're looking for a simple fiat on-ramp or futures trading, Kraken is the best place for you. So again, as I said, we have the camera for streaming behind you. So just know that whatever you say here is going to be broadcasted to the internet. So keep that in mind. Try to kind of stay in new places, do not be too distracting to other people around you. If you can, that would help. And yeah, so I guess, so today we have Alex Gladstein with us. Alex is the Chief Strategy Officer at the Human Rights Foundation. And I think this is one of his, not his first time, but one of his first times in VR. So Alex, you could turn on your megaphone, your amplify my voice thing.
Yeah, I think it's on, right?
Yeah, you're probably right. Yeah, it is. Yep.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's my first VR event. This is not my first time in VR.
It's close enough. It's close enough. What does it feel like? I don't.
It's really cool. I love seeing all these wonderful avatars out there.
Yeah, it's a colorful bunch. It's fun. So look, I was really happy that you agreed to join us. I've been following a lot of your talks. They kind of, you know, they have this mix between being somewhat frightening, but also really inspirational. I really like them. And I thought maybe before we move on, you could tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about the HRF.
Sure. So my name's Alex. I've been working at a nonprofit called the Human Rights Foundation since 2007. And my first job that summer was actually to put together backpacks of kind of contraband media and films to be smuggled into Cuba. My colleagues, some of them were Latin American, and they could travel to Cuba totally legally. They would leave the US and go to Mexico and then go to Cuba. And at the time, there was no internet at all really in Cuba. Now they have this thing called the Paquete system where people have figured out how to get satellite devices, and then they kind of download essentially like Spanish Netflix onto big hard drives, and then they go around neighborhoods and share them, and people take what they want. But before that, there was just very little outside information. In Cuba, it's a communist country, so the government basically, you know, has to approve every book that exists. So there was a huge thirst for outside information, and one of our projects when I first started working at HRF was to provide materials to the underground library movement. So people would meet up in, you know, groups of 3 to 4 people. They'd sit inside someone's home and they'd watch a film, and oftentimes it was a foreign film. We would send in stuff like V for Vendetta. We would send stuff in like Braveheart. We would also send like comedies, Woody Allen's movies. And obviously they'd be dubbed into Spanish, and people would have like little conversations about them, and it was quite meaningful. We ended up doing a whole bunch of other work there. And then later in my career at HRF, I worked a lot on our North Korea programs. So we ended up creating an initiative where we would send outside information into North Korea with the help of people who've escaped. And that program's been really successful. We've sent in close to 90,000 flash drives and USB keys into North Korea, and each one reaches anywhere from 10 to 50 people from our data. So I think we've impacted probably a large percentage not a large, but a non-trivial percentage of the North Korean population has gotten some of our stuff, which is, again, mostly South Korean dramas and soap operas, but some sort of Hollywood and Bollywood stuff as well. Some
How do you
news,
do
some
that physically?
documentaries.
How do you drop flash drives?
Yeah, so in 70 years ago, or 60 years ago, the Germans would obviously send information into East Germany and across the Iron Curtain by balloons. And I believe this is what is referenced in this 99 Red Balloon song, actually, I found out. But the Koreans basically borrowed this from the Germans, and both the North and the South, which were both dictatorships, of course, at one point, they were both sending each other propaganda. So I interviewed a guy who used to work for the North Korean government in the early 90s, and he essentially, he was like shooting down balloons that the South sent. And the South sent stuff about sports. The South sent stuff that was like scantily clad women, all kinds of stuff they would send over the South Korean government. I was interviewing him. He remembers literally shooting these balloons down that were sent over from the South. But the South Korean government stopped doing this during the Sunshine period. So about 20 years ago, the South Korean government stopped doing government-sponsored balloon drops. So that was left in the hands of civil society organizations. So we started helping some of those folks because they had no help. But ultimately, we realized and I put some GPS trackers on those things, and I can tell you that those balloons go really far. So I put a GPS tracker on a balloon. We floated it at night over the DMZ, and it went to Vladivostok. So it went 400 miles. So it went all the way over Korea to Russia. So the idea is you attach a small bag under the balloon, and it has a little acid timer. So after a certain amount of time, this little piece of plastic gets burned through by the acid in the bag. It's a garbage bag of stuff just gets dropped. So it's like DVDs, money, food, whatever. But this is not super effective for various reasons because you can't really steer it, and some of them go through if you're doing a ton. Like when the government was doing it, it was worthwhile. But we realized the best thing to do is to think about radio broadcasts, which are very useful. A lot of North Koreans can listen to radio. And then the most important is just to work on getting information in over the border with China. So the border with China is very long. It's very hard to police the whole thing. And there's tons of stuff that gets in every day that's both legal and illegal. So most of the stuff we send in goes in that way. And ends up being a window to the outside world for North Koreans. And then over time, I had just different conversations, over the years with people about Bitcoin, but I got very interested at the end of 2016 when there's a guy named Bill Tai who was on the board of Bitfury, and he was like, hey, what if Bitfury was interested in like engaging some of the human rights activists at your conferences with this idea of Bitcoin? And I said, that sounds great. And a few months later, we did our first event together, and it's really been down the rabbit hole ever since. And what I've noticed is when I interview activists now, I talk to them about finance, money, and it's always fascinating to see, what they come up with. Like I was talking to someone from Eritrea the other day, and one of the things the Eritrean government, which is like the North Korea of Africa, it's on the Horn of Africa, and one of the things that they did about less than 10 years ago even was they just scrapped all the money in the whole country. So everybody had been saving up cash to do different things, and the government came out and said, okay, that money is no longer going to be valid. You have to exchange it for this money. And it's like financial repression. And North Korea did the same thing, right? So North Korea in 2009 scrapped the entire currency, and this led to a lot of defections. And the more repressive the regime, the more repressive the financial repression is what I think you'll see. And then there's, of course, things like hyperinflation that I'm sure you've all read about. But generally speaking, people have a lot of problems with money around the world, and it's often not part of the human rights story, which is weird. I invited this guy from Zimbabwe named Evan Mawire, who's he's a civil society leader. He created a protest movement which brought Mugabe down, basically. He did something called a stay-at-home protest where 9 million Zimbabweans didn't go to work one day. And it like paralyzed the whole country, and it showed the power of the people. And this created a protest movement which ended up bringing Mugabe down. And I invited him to San Francisco to give a talk about hyperinflation. And he's like, no one's ever asked me to talk about this before. And I said, why not? And he's like, well, it's usually human rights. And I said, well, just talk about your experience with it. And the first thing he did on stage was he takes his necklace out. Apparently he's wearing the 1980 Zimbabwe dollar around his neck. And apparently a lot of the activists wear it as a symbol of what their dollar used to be. So in 1980, the Zimbabwean dollar was worth $2. And then, of course, over the next 25 years, it became worth $0. And there's, of course, a lot of Bitcoiners like to have the trillion-dollar notes or whatever. Yeah. But there's a lot of pain and suffering behind that story. So I've seen a lot of this over the years, and I'm convinced that Bitcoin has a very important role to play with regard to both people who don't have access to the financial system or are restricted in some way, but also from a privacy perspective to build a new kind of transacting in a way that doesn't reveal our entire identity stack. So those are two big interests of mine.
Right. Yeah, I think that this kind of combination of these two things is really exciting. We don't see a lot of people talk to mainstream audiences about that, and I think it's really interesting. And I want to try to take this conversation from the frightening part to slowly into the optimistic area of maybe how Bitcoin can help and how similar technologies can help. And I'm gonna put on some slides that you sent me. And I thought we could start with, what digital surveillance looked like before COVID-19, because it seems like it was so long ago, but it wasn't, and things kind of got worse from there. but yeah, I'm kind of curious because I saw a lot of your talks from last year, and you talk a lot about things like how in China, for example, they would have those credit systems, for example, that almost dictate the society for some people, dictate how society works. So I wonder if you could kind of expand on that.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. Surveillance is something that governments have always dreamed of over the thousands of years that they've existed. And in the 20th century, you saw physical surveillance reach terrifying heights, right? With the Stasi. I mean, like 1 out of every 50 people in Eastern Germany was an informant, essentially. And this happened in Mao's China. This happened in Cuba. This happened in North Korea. You have this system of basically community policing. And that was like the best governments could do until they started to realize that they could use technology to aid and abet their ability to spy on their people. And I think it wasn't really until pretty recently when that ability came to be realized through things like big data analysis. So I know we've had digital money for a long time in the form of credit cards. I know that we've had digital communications for a long time, but really until the last decade or so, when governments could start easily looking at what are 100 million people doing. They couldn't really do that before we had sort of big data analysis, right? Or if you want to call it AI or whatever. But this gives them new powers to police and surveil people. So even before this whole COVID experience, we've seen obviously huge amount of surveillance in both open societies and closed ones. In the open societies, there's been some movement and some protest and some innovation. Obviously, I think the fact that, for example, WhatsApp adopted, end-to-end encryption was because of Snowden's revelations in many ways, right? So certain things that we get to hear about because we have a free media impact our lives. Whereas in China, it's not like that. It's not the average person knew about Snowden's revelations, right? It's unless the law to find out, they had no idea what that was, right? So ditto in North Korea or many other countries. So I think our free press and free information environment does allow us to fight back a little bit. But ultimately, governments are always going to just be thirsty. I remember talking to a Danish banker. She was the CFO or CEO of one of the biggest banks in Europe. And I gave a talk about Bitcoin and surveillance and privacy. And afterwards she said, I think you're wrong. We don't know enough about our clients, And I'm like, well, what would be, I was like, well, what would be too much, And she couldn't answer me. And it's like the banality of evil. She's a good person and has a family and whatever, but she's been taught to believe that that her company and the government should know as much as possible about every citizen, and that's a good thing. And that was really scary to me. And I think that that's kind of what we're faced with, is that officials and authorities and corporate leaders see this as sort of like a good thing, that it can be more secure and everybody can be more safe if we know everything about everybody. And that's kind of inevitably where governments are going to go. So that's why technologies like Bitcoin and Signal are so important, and many others, because it allows us to take that ability away from them, right?
Right. But that's an interesting point. I mean, when you look, there are a lot of like commercial corporate style products that, the people who build them, they know everything about their users, because if it's a digital product, if it's an app, they know like every click you make, they know when you do it, they know everything, and they can use that to make it better for you, right? They can use that to make it a better experience for you. And, I'm kind of sort of involved with the development community over things like Bitcoin. And you can see how that's missing sometimes, because
well,
with Bitcoin,
let me tie this image behind me to what we're saying.
Yeah.
So essentially, you need a lot of data about people to do social engineering in a digital sense. Like you need to suck up a lot of data about them and learn as much as possible about them. So what the Chinese government has figured out is that if they can essentially build a system where your ability to transact and take out loans and have perks in life like getting visas and sending your kids to good schools, if that can be tied to like a credit score as it is in the West, like that would be really helpful. But their credit score isn't just creditworthiness and financial health. It's also a whole bunch of other things like behavior, micro habits, demographics, whether you are an ethnic minority, whether you are a sexual minority, whether you have said something against the government. So it's essentially more like a patriot score or like a citizen score that they're building. And their whole goal is that they know that it is way better to have self-censorship than to have like the iron fist. Like it's cheaper if the whole society is afraid and won't do anything than to go out and beat everybody up. So this system is brilliant because it basically engineers a society that's afraid to speak out, right? And the government doesn't have to go and arrest everyone. It's just the climate of fear, the threat of, this threat that looms is what holds everything in place. And that's why this system, even though this system is like, basically, it's, if you look at this thing, it's overblown in the media. Like there's not one citizen score for everybody in China, but it's like a lot of different companies and regions are experimenting with it. And the CCP definitely the Chinese Communist Party definitely wants everybody to be on some sort of score in the next couple of years. The New York Times said it was more Kafkaesque than Orwellian right now, which I thought was pretty fitting. Like a lot of it doesn't work well, but they're getting there. But their intention is quite clear. They want everybody to be, in this system where like you want to be a good citizen and a good patriot, so you want to have a good score, right? So that is dangerous for civil liberties, and this is something that I was obviously studying and paying close attention to before COVID, but now we're in like a whole new era of mass surveillance, because I think that public health is something that people are more willing to give up their rights for than things like terror or things like that. Like this is like 9/11 on steroids in many ways, because so many people are willing to give up more as long as they don't get sick, right? Is the narrative. And you're seeing all these like people in positions of power, basically like in Australia the other day, saying the Australian government said that basically it is essential for everybody to be surveilled for the country to go back to normal, is what he said, is what's one of the ministers of the government said. And that's a crazy Orwellian doublespeak. Like, what do you mean go back to normal? We weren't surveilled before, Yeah.
So like it's this kind of a condition, right?
Yeah, and I think this is what I've been talking a lot about lately, is this idea of like the normalization of mass surveillance after COVID. Like, again, Google and Apple, pre-COVID, if Google and Apple had been like, hey, we're going to install Bluetooth like tracking system on all of your phones, people would have been like, whoa, that's weird. But now everybody's like, that's great. Let's get involved. Go Google and Apple. It's like, what did they do over the last decade to win your trust on privacy? So what the thing you just showed is I think the slippery slope of where we're going is that you will, in China today, in cities that are coming out of lockdown, you have to have a green score on your app to leave your home or go to work or get on public transit. And the chairman of the Human Rights Foundation, Garry Kasparov, the Russian chess great, he always makes this old Soviet joke where he says, there's nothing more permanent than a temporary measure. So those color codes aren't going away. You know what I mean? So these things are going to be around, and it's not like the color codes are connected to your body. They're not like biometric. some bureaucrat is deciding whether you're green or red or yellow, right? So this is adding a whole new level of control over you from the state. And it's one that's more widely accepted than before because most people are willing to give up a little bit of rights and freedoms to not get sick. So it's a really, really dangerous moment, I think. And it's one where we really have to reject this stuff. And I think that's why, even though Google and Apple are saying that their system's going to be privacy preserving, like we can go into that and why that may not even be true. Even if it's true, it's still dangerous because they're not building the apps. Governments are building the apps. And ultimately, it's going to make people more normalized and comfortable with surveillance. And I don't think we need it. If you actually talk to and interview medical workers and authorities of countries who are dealing with COVID, digital contact tracing doesn't even really work. You can actually interview the Taiwanese health authorities who've been doing some pretty crazy mass surveillance. And they basically admitted that this has only been helpful in one case, basically. And Singapore has said the same thing. They've been trying to monitor people using a Bluetooth tracking exposure app. And they basically said this doesn't replace traditional contact tracing, which is when you interview people at when you're sick, you go to the hospital, hi, who'd you come into touch, who did you come into contact with? We'll call those people and warn them. That's really important. I mean, that's a critical function of our healthcare infrastructure. But the idea that you can automate it using phone is not, there's no evidence for that. So Google and Apple print this thing. Yeah, and it could literally be installed on phones for a third of the world's population, billions of people. And the second paragraph of their white paper for this thing makes a broad assumption that digital contact tracing works. And that's not true. So the whole thing is premised on bunk science to me. It's like a lot of it is like witchcraft,
Yeah. Yeah, it's weird, in Israel. I think Israel was one of the first countries to go really extreme with digital tracking. And they actually have at least like 3 programs here that are completely different, ran by completely different organizations, which really makes it difficult to understand what's going on too, because actually there's this tweet from Maya, who's a good friend of mine in Israel. So, they have this discussion about how, well, this program isn't really helpful at all, but actually there are, and they might stop it because of that. But then there are 2 or 3 others that still go on, and they're vastly different. So there are programs that would track your cellular location, but there are others that are kind of privacy preserving, sort of, where your phone would report only if you get sick or whatever.
Right, but didn't your government come out recently and say that it didn't really work or something? What was that all about?
So that's the confusing part, and that's this tweet. That's the confusing part because they say about one program that it didn't work, but they didn't cancel the others, right? And from what I've seen, this is true for other countries too. Like a lot of them run multiple experiments and multiple programs, and then even when they say we're going to stop this one, there are actually at least 2 others that run could continue to run in the background. So that's really difficult.
But this is kind of crazy. We have a pretty wide body of knowledge from Taiwan, from Singapore, from Israel, that this doesn't work very well, and either way, it doesn't replace normal contact tracing, which is what we should be focusing on. It's not the right thing to do.
So do you want to maybe look into a bit how this Google and Apple program works?
You seem to. Why don't?
Yeah, I can go ahead.
I mean, you should.
I can go ahead. So the way they didn't really share a lot of details. They shared some details, which was interesting. It's more than what government agencies usually share. So it was nice that they shared something, right? But they didn't share everything about it. And the general idea seems to be that you would walk around with your phone and you would have Bluetooth low energy turned on, which is kind of a version of Bluetooth that shouldn't use too much of your battery, and it should also only work for very short distances, which is good for this. So you would kind of broadcast a random code that your phone creates automatically, and other phones around you would keep that code. It would save it to know that these 2 people were next to each other. And then at some point in the future, if someone is confirmed to be sick, then probably through a government agency, they would broadcast that code as, someone who has been sick. And then everyone who has that code in their history should be able to know that they've been in that area. And it sounds, it sounds a lot better than just collecting your GPS location, which is
Yes.
bad. And it's also maybe not useful because GPS isn't that accurate. Like, what do you do if you have, that you've been next to someone in 20 meters of accuracy? That's
GPS is not
very
accurate enough
useful.
for this.
Yeah.
No.
So it seems like it's good, but there are a lot of questions, like who gets the permission to kind of broadcast this. I mean, when I first saw this, I was excited. I was like, okay, this is a major improvement. This is great. But as I rethought, this business, it's still, obviously, it's much worse than what we have now, right? And
well, here's why there's a couple issues. Number one, they have no plan to deal with false positives. So like, someone's got to say like, how does the system know that somebody's positive? You know what I mean? Like, like who, meaning like, can a user just randomly click a button on their app and
they can
say
use
they're
a
positive?
blockchain for that. No, I'm kidding. Sorry.
Yeah, sure. No, but like the point is, like, is there a doctor key? Like in the app, does a doctor need to? Will only a doctor have a permission to tell you that you're positive, or that? So there's like, that's ripe for problems right there. Second of all, Bluetooth is very accurate, but what if you're like in a car and you're 5 feet away from someone who's in a different car? Like, Bluetooth will say that you were exposed. Okay, so that's another problem that is not escapable by technology. Like that's just a permanent issue with this. And thirdly, remember, this is the base protocol. So people are going to build apps on top of this thing. And really what we're looking at here is that existing, if you think about the way existing government cell phone tracking works, again, it's not as accurate as this because they use, triangulation and they use GPS, and it's not quite as accurate. Like, they can figure out who you are, but this would allow them potentially, if they build apps on top of this protocol, which all of a sudden Google and Apple would push out to potentially over time billions of people, they could literally have a real-time understanding of every single human-to-human interaction. Okay, so that's the scary thing. So for those three things, mission creep, false positives, and the fact that the system just doesn't really take into account the fact that it could be wrong if you're next to somebody but there's a wall between you. I just don't see why this is something that people are excited about. I think it should be something we definitely fight back against.
Right. You're saying, like, if the Apple and Google can build a protocol, but then the government can push an app that has whatever inside it, you'll never know what's actually doing. And it could be either due to incompetency or malice, could be both. But whatever it is, they could be collecting a lot more than we think. And this kind of white paper of what Apple and Google wrote is kind of putting this veil of authenticity on top of it. But what we really get is not necessarily built by Apple and Google even.
Yeah, all I'm saying is that they're not building the apps. So the apps are going to be built by governments, and the apps are going to be built by corporations. So it's highly unlikely that those apps that you'll actually use will not have PII, like will not have personal information attached to it, like will not have cell phone. Like, everybody first saw the news and they were like, "Oh, this is so cool! It'll work without your phone number and all this stuff." And I'm like, I don't think so. Let's actually see these apps in the wild. I guarantee there's going to be some mix of identifying information. And again, that's just a slippery slope towards micro Bluetooth location tracking, which again, even if you're like, whatever, man, the authorities are already spying on us already. Why would you want to give them an additional level of accuracy? That's ridiculous, Like I understand that they're already spying on us, but Bluetooth is a whole new ballgame of being able to understand who you spoke to, not just if you're in the same room, but potentially who you spoke to. So I think I'm very skeptical of this whole thing. And in South Korea and in China, they've started to like mix this, tracking you with financial surveillance as well. So in South Korea, again, which is an open society, this is very scary though. They're looking at your financial history to see where you bought stuff. And that's how they're trying to figure out, did you come into contact with somebody or not? And this is just so obviously ripe for abuse, and is why I think financial privacy is very important, because if they don't have the data in the first place, then they can't exploit it. I guess that would be the theme of today's conversation. Like,
Right.
if you don't feed Big Brother with your data, then it doesn't grow any bigger. It can't grow bigger just through technology alone. It has to have data.
Right.
So
And
that's the point.
yeah, and we've been seeing like governments push to using digital payment tools more during the last few months. Kind of, I guess the reasoning is that maybe using cash is dangerous because maybe you could get sick from using cash.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people were, talking about this, but ultimately governments will claim, some have already, that cash is dangerous because it could spread disease. And I mean, look, that may be true. I mean, the cash is pretty gross. I think it's important for privacy and human rights, but ultimately, I think Andreas said this at one point in one of his talks. I remember a couple of years ago, but I mean, people are going to look back and be like, wait, we used to carry around a piece of paper as money. That's like really disgusting. So
Yeah.
I think there's some truth to that, which is all the more reason why we need the equivalent in the digital space of being able to transact privately, because the paper money's
Right.
going away.
Right.
Oh,
But we don't have it. Do we have it? I mean, do you see Bitcoin as something that people could actually use now as a replacement for cash?
obviously not now, but I believe
Yeah.
that it's the foundation for a new system whereby people can at least selectively transact with others in a way that preserves privacy. I don't think people are going to need that for every transaction, but if you can just start doing certain things, auto billing, if you can start doing things that relate to your phone carrier, relate to your internet service. I mean, if you can pay for certain things in a way that doesn't leak your entire identity stack, then that's going to be helpful for you. I mean, for me, it's just about how do we shrink the Big Brother as much as possible. So we want to be paying for stuff in a way that doesn't link together and leak all of our pieces of our identity. And I think that like the Bitcoin stack gives us some promise there. I know Lightning is very nascent and rudimentary at this point, but theoretically, you can make transactions that are instant and convenient and that don't leak a huge amount of information. I mean, in fact, they leak basically nothing about you. So that would be such a different path than the current path we're on, which is the path of going from credit cards to mobile payments to touchless payments to wearable payments to chips under our skin, which will leak everything about us. So I think that's really important that we break the fork in the road now, and we try to build a different kind of system.
I do have to say though that in practice, for a lot of people, something like Bitcoin actually does leak a lot of information, maybe a lot more than when they would use their bank app or whatever. And that kind of, there's this distance between the promise and what we actually have. I mean, most people who use Bitcoin, I would say, probably leak a ton of information while they're doing it.
Yeah,
and they don't even know.
I think the idea is the following, like, it's about what does the merchant see, right? So when you buy something from a corner store with a $20 bill, the merchant doesn't know anything about you, right? If you buy something from a merchant, you can pay them with Bitcoin or Lightning in a way that they don't really know anything about you. And it requires operational security, and it requires you to use Bitcoin in a smart way. But that's the promise, right? I mean, that's what what a lot of us, I think, are in it for, is to preserve the idea of cash, but in the future. I mean, to give you another example of why it's so important, last summer in Hong Kong, when people were going out to protest, they were like buying their Metro cards using cash. Normally they'd use a top up on an Oyster card type thing called an Octopus card. But that, of course, in many cases is linked to their identity, and they were worried about their employers finding out that they were protesting, or the school authorities finding out that the students were protesting, so they get in trouble. So if they use cash, then like the government doesn't know how to, they can't link them to that particular path on the subway, getting off at that stop and protesting.
Right.
But so cash is really important in Hong Kong right now, but in the future, they won't have cash anymore, right? So what are they going to do? So this is why I think it's important that we experiment and iterate in this area. And that's why I think it's really important and noble for people to be working on Bitcoin privacy, because it's a process that takes a long time. Like, it doesn't happen overnight. But I do believe that it's going in the right direction. But yeah, I mean, I bought something with Lightning the other day online. Yeah, I have to give the website my address. So there's things that, like, you have to,
Right.
you
Yeah.
have to think about. Like, maybe the best way of doing it is basically what Amazon has now, where you buy something with Lightning, for example, or Bitcoin, and you have it delivered to the locker at a supermarket, and you pick it up, right? I mean, there are ways you can do that. Amazon has allowed you to pick up, in America at least, you can pick up stuff at any Whole Foods that's from Amazon. So theoretically, you could do this in a way that doesn't leak your entire freaking identity stack. And that's really the key, is how do we get there?
Of course, maybe there's a camera there, right?
Yes, you wear a mask, man. Now everybody's wearing a mask.
It's even easier now, yeah. Yeah, that's true. And I mean, so do you think that, I mean, because you've been working with activists all over the world, and I wonder do you think that people have the capacity and the free time maybe to think about all of the things that could go wrong when they're paying with something like Bitcoin, and to think about the operational security they have to go through to really protect their identities? Because I agree with you, I think it's possible, but it's it's very taxing to.
Very taxing.
Yeah.
I think it just, people will figure out. Never underestimate people is something I've learned. I mean, I just got to interview somebody the other day who, as a student, figured out a way to create a 1 million-person movement to overthrow Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia peacefully without a shot fired over a decade. And, he and his friends sat down at a cafe and plotted this, and they ended up executing it perfectly. So they didn't even have technology, really. I mean, not at least what we have today. So I wouldn't underestimate people's ability. And if you talk to dissidents in countries like ranging from places like Iran to China to Venezuela to even Hong Kong, Palestine, I mean, people have figured out how to use Bitcoin already. You're right, though, that they haven't thought through the privacy aspect of it, which is why I think that widespread, easy to engage with innovations like BTC Pay Server are really important. I mean, think about that just for 1 second. Like, a big use case for Bitcoin, obviously, is for civil society organizations in dictatorships who need to get money from abroad from donors. So currently, if I want to give a Russian NGO, let's say I'm excited about teaching some economic theory, like whether it's progressive or libertarian or whatever, I want to fund a class in Russia to teach students about that. I can't do that right now. Like, I can't legally do that because the Putin regime has changed the laws to prevent foreign funding. So we have to basically do this crazy operation that's very risky. Well, if I can just sit down with that one person that works at that school, and I can teach them how to set up a BTC Pay Server, private link online somewhere, we can start getting to where we need to be, And then when they need to pay for program costs, what we would do is sit down with them and teach them how to take that Bitcoin and turn it into rubles. And there's a lot of ways to do that. And some of them are very privacy preserving, depending on how you do it. Again, in Hong Kong, for example, today, the ATMs that are Bitcoin ATMs don't require KYC, and they don't really have limits either, from what I understand from my friend Leo. So you can support Hong Kong activists right now with Bitcoin, and they can withdraw into fiat and not compromise their identity. So it depends on what part of the world you're in, but it's definitely possible. And I think we just need to work towards it. I mean, look, I saw this thing happen with peer-to-peer encrypted messaging 10 years ago, or when I was first starting, 13 or 14 years ago with this. They didn't know that people were using email and text, and they didn't realize the vulnerabilities, Even famous activists weren't using stuff. Now, through the work of the Human Rights Foundation and other organizations, we've teamed up to show them, hey, you should use Signal. It's actually really important. It's not perfect. You could still get in trouble, but why don't you try to move 60% of your communications to Signal, as opposed to just it all being on an obviously surveilled or compromised platform like WhatsApp or text or whatever. So it's just I've seen that work. So all of a sudden, so the Human Rights Foundation planned an entire conference last year that was done in a secret location, all on Signal. So it's possible, you know? People were like, what's Signal? I don't want to use it. It's too complicated. It's 2x ducks. It's like, well, too bad. You have to use it. You know, figure it out. So they did, you know, and we got 100 people to a secret location and spent a few days together, and it was really productive. So all was done on Signal. No email, no phone. So I think that that's it's possible.
That's amazing.
But
yeah.
But we have to, you know, so one of the things I'm trying to do at Href is create workshops where people can, it's, you know, understanding what Bitcoin is not something you can really teach, because it's different things to different people, and it takes years to develop your understanding of it, and then that changes over time. So the main thing is, like, rather than trying to teach them what Bitcoin is, let me try to teach you how to accept a donation in this particular currency, and then let me teach you how to shave that off into fiat when you need to. That's kind of what I would like to teach to people. And then they'll learn about Bitcoin at their own pace, you know? But I just want them to be able to receive it in a way that's relatively private. Like, no address reuse, you know, don't use exchanges that require KYC. Like, let's just set you up with a direct relationship with a donor. I feel like in the next 2 to 3 years, it'll be to the point where I can donate to somebody and that person will have a BTC pay server type setup on their website, which will totally clean the coins. There'll be a coin join type system that happens automatically. They won't have to do it on their own, and they will then have clean coins, and they could do whatever they want with that. That, I think, needs to be the goal for, like, funding civil society organizations. And if you
Right.
look at it just over the last 5 years, if you look at the pace of innovation with coin join stuff, man, it's happening. It's pretty amazing. I mean, yes, there's a problem with the centralized trusted party, but, like, have you played with the Samurai app on Android? It's pretty amazing. So
Yeah.
so I think we're getting there, you know?
Yeah, you're right. You know, it's absolutely right how things change with things like PGP in the past, which was almost impossible for normal people.
You could get any activist
to Signal
PGP,
today,
but Signal, they'll use it, you know? So
yeah, I agree with you. That's amazing. And you know, if anyone is going to be an early adopter of privacy stuff, it's probably people who literally needed to stay alive, right? So so yeah. We talk a lot about it, but, you know, there's a lot of big talk. But people who actually need it, they'll probably jump through the hoops if they have to.
Yeah. So I was just, you know, this is something I like to point out, but I believe that Bitcoin is such a powerful tool because it allows us to basically prevent dictators from doing what they want to do. Like, Xi Jinping wants, like, a total micro understanding of your daily life, which he gets right now. But if you opt out into Bitcoin, like, he no longer knows. He has to go try and figure out what's happening on the blockchain and make a bunch of heuristic assumptions. And that's not going to work long term. Like, he's just not going to know what you're doing. And Putin can't freeze your Bitcoin account. It's pretty obvious, even though he can freeze your bank account. And if you look at governments like the Burmese dictatorship, they just delete the property records and the identity documents of religious minorities. So guess what? They can't delete their access to Bitcoin. And, you know, even my government does, I think, bad things like countrywide sanctions, which punish people who didn't even get to elect their leaders. So if you live in Iran, you have a terrible government, but guess what? You didn't elect that government, right? So the average young person in Iran is suffering. So, you know, this allows them to get around that. And then same thing in Venezuela with regard to just, you know, this whole idea of the government printing more money and devaluing your savings. Obviously, you can opt out of that too. So it's such a powerful tool for all these reasons.
Yeah, this is amazing. Yeah, I love this slide. It really puts things into context. And I think with this optimistic, I'm glad we kind of managed to get to the optimistic view at the end. And I think with this optimistic view, we can open it to like audience questions.
So I wanted to start with Eric Wall, who has a really interesting point. Yeah. So where's Eric?
Where's Eric?
Eric,
okay, you should click your raise hand button on your bottom right corner of the screen. Do you see that? Yeah, okay, good. Now you can go ahead.
Okay, so Eric and I were talking earlier. Hey, Eric. So So let me just give you a framework for this. Bitcoin aside, I hope that many of you would agree that in the near term, at least, when we all have to use fiat money to do stuff, it would be great if there could be a digital way to do that that's more privacy protecting than the current crazy system that leaks all of our stuff. So some people think that that's going to be done by central governments, meaning there are some people in the modern monetary theory crowd who believe that they can lobby the US government, for example, to create private treasury checking accounts for American citizens that are, you know, through zero knowledge proofs or whatever, going to be private. I might be skeptical of that, but that's one way of thinking. Eric has a different theory. So we wanted Eric to be able to talk about how he thinks people might be able to, in the near term, have like essentially a private dollar.
Right. Eric, go ahead. And actually, Eric, if you want, you can run over this stage.
Just you can come up and join me on the couch, dude.
Did you give me stage access?
Because I know you like to talk a lot, so.
I've been waiting for this.
Right here, man. Good to see you.
Oh, good to be here. So basically, for about 1 year now, I've been working together with Alex in investigating different privacy solutions in cryptocurrency, and obviously Bitcoin was the main sort of subject, but we also covered other privacy technologies such as Zcash, Monero, and in one of the last series in this, in one of the last articles in the series, we discussed stablecoins. And in my view, Bitcoin right now, it's an amazing store of value, but in order for it to act as a medium of exchange, I think it's still a bit premature because of the volatility. And I think that if you look at what people actually want to use, if you go to a country like Venezuela and you ask them what is currency that they favor above all, it's not Bitcoin. It might be in the future, but right now the main demand is actually on dollars. And what those people need, like the ideal currency for these people would be a dollar that is, first of all, it needs to be bearer so that it can't be shut down by some central server. It also needs to be private, and it needs to be censorship resistant. And one thing that I noticed is that one thing that I've been noticing is that, well, we are starting to have synthetic dollars in the Ethereum ecosystem. I'm not saying that MakerDAO is perfect. I know that there are still centralized points in MakerDAO, and maybe MakerDAO is the best project. But if you look at the construction itself of Maker, like the concept that you could have cryptocurrencies collateralizing a dollar pegged synthetic, that concept in itself is interesting, because that way you do get a dollar that isn't that is censorship resistant, and it's a bearer instrument. And if you're looking at some other recent developments in the Ethereum ecosystem, you have pretty quickly advancing privacy technologies. So, I mean, in Bitcoin, we have Wasabi, we have Samurai, and we have Join Market. We have ways to mix our coins. In my opinion, I use those tools a lot. And frankly, honestly, as a Bitcoin, advanced user, I still find it pretty cumbersome to use Bitcoin privacy. For instance, the Wasabi mixing pool has about 0.1 Bitcoin as the minimum amount that you need in order to mix your coins. Meanwhile, if you're looking at something like Aztec protocol in Ethereum, there aren't any such limitations, and it's still under development, but you could actually get not only transaction graph privacy in Aztec, you could also get privacy of the amounts that you're spending, sort of like confidential transactions in Liquid. So the privacy tooling in Ethereum is advancing pretty quickly, and at the same time, you have these bearer censorship-resistant dollars. To me, that feels like they're combining the best of all worlds into like in form of a currency that you would want to use in an authoritarian country. You want the dollar, you want it to be bearer resistant, and you want privacy tools that aren't clunky and that function well. So I'm just curious to hear, Alex, your take. And I know that you have some criticisms to this, but what I'm saying, it's like a project in development, and I'm pretty optimistic about where it could go. And I just want to hear.
Yeah,
what
I'd like to hear.
You know,
Eric,
Eric, I think your mic was maybe off. Can you please repeat that Ethereum speech quickly?
the whole
No, I'm
thing.
kidding. Yeah, can you repeat the whole thing? No, I'm joking. I'm joking. Don't please.
All right, don't do
Let's
that.
go ahead.
Okay, so yes, so in my mind, I think of what I've talked to you about with regard to Bitcoin as, like, again, this isn't in competition with what Eric has just mentioned. Bitcoin is creating a new economic system that is totally obsoletes the old one. It's a new way of transacting that's totally rooted in a totally different paradigm. What Eric is saying is maybe we can use technology to upgrade or improve the legacy system in some way, like that is based on dollars. So at least that's my interpretation of it. So I think that it's definitely something that's worth looking at. I think that in general, you could think of maybe, look, maybe people are going to have Bitcoin as their savings or whatever, but maybe as they think of their checking account as other monetary tools like fiat, and maybe you're willing to accept the security risk or the centralization risk of using stuff like private stablecoins, for example, which don't have the same decentralization and security as Bitcoin, but maybe for small amounts where you're trying to preserve your privacy, maybe it works. I mean, I'm certainly interested in whatever is going to improve civil liberties for people, What you're describing, I don't really think exists yet, but perhaps it could. Perhaps it could. I mean, Udi, what's your take?
Yeah, I mean, I think any way to use anything privately is awesome. If someone makes a project that makes it easier to use Tether or USDC or whatever in a private way, then great. But I do kind of have to push back. MakerDAO is not decentralized at all. I mean, it's
right.
I view it as
and
centralized.
I didn't say that it was. I said MakerDAO like instructions, like
the
concept of using crypto as collateral to peg.
I know, but the concept doesn't exist. I mean, the concept as a concept exists, but as a practical thing, it doesn't seem to exist right now. So if if someone finds a solution, I can think of a way. But if someone finds a solution, that's great. But even if they don't, even if we use centralized things like Tether or USDC or whatever, then having a privacy solution for that is great. I would say, however, that all of those, things like you mentioned Aztec, and there are other, zero knowledge proof things that happen on Ethereum. All of these technologies can be easily implemented without Ethereum. So you can easily have a stable coin like thing, like Tether, by just using a database, and you can put whatever ZKP technologies you want on top of that, and you're already trusting the issuer. So you're fine with trusting the issuer.
Yeah, well, I mean, Liberty Reserve, that's essentially something like that. They had.
Yeah, I agree with you. It might get shut down. Yeah, it might get shut down. But the same is true for. Same is true for probably for Tether and Circle and all of the other folks doing stablecoins. I mean, if they allow privacy things, that they might get shut down. Maybe not. Maybe they do. I don't know. But they have the same risk whether they're using Ethereum or not.
Yeah, and that's why I mentioned crypto-backed dollar synthetics specifically, because they cannot, if done correctly, if we solve the Oracle problem, I'm just saying that there is a type of money that we could create, and from what I can see, I mean, it's an amazing opportunity. If we really care about financial privacy, then Bitcoin is the long-term goal. But we might be able to deliver some type of more accessible solution by working on the open innovation that we have access to today. That's my only point, basically.
Yeah, and I guess my general reaction to that is that if people build it and it works, I think there'll be a lot of appetite for that. As Udi's saying, it doesn't exist right now, and there are reasons to believe that it might never exist from both social, political, technical reasons. And so at the end of the day, people may be forced to, if they care about being outside the state, if they want to move money from one country to another or save it, they use Bitcoin as like as their kind of savings account or as their base layer account. And then they shave off into fiat where they need to spend, and they're back into the centralized financial world. To me, sometimes the stable coins seem like an unnecessary middle piece where it's like all these people are saying they're going to use Bitcoin anyway. Then they're going to go from Bitcoin to DAI to dollars or something like that. So for me, it's just, I haven't seen the need for it yet, but clearly if there could be an implementation that works, I'd be very excited about it. Just haven't seen it yet.
Yeah, same. Yeah.
I mean, Eric, how would that? Who would build it? Like, who would build it without getting arrested? How would you do that?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that is going to happen is that you're probably going to see the existing MakerDAO DAI token get incorporated into the Aztec protocol, and then you're going to have quasi, semi decentralized stable.
Whoa! But it's going to be the DAI token, right?
Yes, and so.
So what if the VCs who control DAI don't want it to be private because they don't want to get sued by the U.S. government?
Well, that they actually cannot. Well, they can't stop that. The DAI token they cannot control. Well, they haven't. Actually, not sure if they can prevent which addresses the DAI.
Wait, but couldn't they just threaten to like do X if people do Y?
Yeah,
like, they totally control DAI.
They could blow the whole system up if they think that it's being used in a privacy. In an anonymous way, they could shut it down. But what I think is that if the ZK, if the DAI in the Aztec protocol fails, then somebody else is going to do it, and they're going to learn what are the attack vectors that make these private censorship resistant dollars get shut down. They're going to try again. Another project is going to come online. They're going to look at what did MakerDAO fail at, and they're going to do it over again until we actually have one. Because if I'm just looking at it, what's feasible with technology, a private censorship-resistant, permissionless dollar is available. A bearer instrument dollar is possible to create. So I think that that's maybe something that we should, just be bullish on and not be so frightened.
And how would you compare this? How would you compare this to an effort to make Tether more private and to just go all in on Tether?
I don't think that's going to work, because I think that if Tether becomes, let's say, the #1 currency used on darknet markets, they're going to get shut down. But it couldn't happen if you had a sufficiently decentralized crypto collateral-backed dollar from Tether.
Of course, this thing doesn't exist, but if it existed, I'm with you. If this thing can exist, if there can be a dollar that's no one can stop, I love it. Sure, bring it on.
But it
doesn't exist right now.
Sorry for interrupting. What do you think, Udi, is the one major hurdle in order for this concept that I've described to exist? Is it the oracles within MakerDAO?
Well, it's a lot of things, and it's its own talk, but it's a lot of things. One of them is I'm not sure there are financial incentives for anyone to build this complicated thing if they can't capitalize on that. That's a big one that we tend to ignore. Another one is the Oracle thing, of course, which I don't see how anyone could solve. It's not a blockchain problem. That's a financial problem that financial institutions deal with all the time, and they didn't solve that for decades. So I don't see how we're going to solve that for something like MakerDAO. Maybe, I don't know, but we don't seem to have even a direction for that.
Just on the Oracle problem, let's say that we do not find like a Uniswap decentralized Oracle to give us decent price. Let's say that it's impossible, even though that it's becoming more possible every day. The oracles from Uniswap are improving, but let's say that doesn't work. Even if we have centralized oracles, let's say we have 100 centralized oracles, but they all exist in different jurisdictions, couldn't we, even if some of those get shut down, couldn't we add other centralized oracles?
Well,
they can't shut down every oracle in every different jurisdiction all over the world. And if they do, let's start it over again.
Right, so why not just use Tether? And Tether is decentral, meaning Tether has like set up legally in different countries. So it's really hard to shut Tether down for different reasons. So why wouldn't you just go with Tether?
No, yeah, well, then in that case, they would have to have hundreds of different bank accounts, but all those bank accounts can be identified and shut down at once. But you cannot shut down oracles. That the oracle job is extremely simple. You just need to feed in a ETH USD feed, and that can be done by anyone in anywhere of the world without any license. Shutting down banks is a lot easier. Shutting down banks accounts is a lot easier, but it's not as easy to shut down, some random.
Yeah, I guess it's just crazy to watch Tether has not been shut down. So, and I just don't know what the appetite of the world governments is to do it.
Well, I think if it was the #1 currency in the dark markets, I think it would probably get shut down. I think so.
Well, all right. I mean, we'll agree to disagree, I guess. But yeah, I'm hopeful. I think I'm as hopeful as you are. I'm just pessimistic. But I would support it for sure if there was a solution. I'm all for it. So yeah, we kind of reached an agreement, sort of.
Yeah, rest assured, Eric will be keeping us posted on whether or not there are exciting developments in that area.
We can make this like a weekly thing when you just show up and tell us what's new in the world of MakerDAO. I mean, it seems like everyone's really loving it.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to speak off stage now.
Thank you, Eric.
I really appreciate it.
Thanks.
That was great.
Enjoy, guys.
Thank you. So
I
Alex,
guess there's just a final comment on that, Udi. Just a final comment.
Sure.
I don't think that's an unhelpful conversation. However, I do think that at the end of the day, if all the effort spent on trying to create this sort of short-term temporary solution on how to make the dollar private, it's just invested in Bitcoin privacy, like there might be a more long-term benefit for humanity. So that's kind of my general thinking. But anyway, what's the next topic? You want to take another question?
So if you have time for a couple more questions, we can just take.
Let's do it.
So let's do it. So let's start with Matt. Matt, you can go on. And if you can throw an emoji so we see where you are. Yep.
Hey, Matt.
Hi. It's not hard to make a person living under an oppressive regime to understand why they need transactional privacy. But how can we make ordinary people living in more or less democratic states understand the same?
Yeah, that's a great point. When I talk about Bitcoin to someone who lives in a dictatorship, when I tell them that it's money that the government doesn't control, they immediately are like, wow, that's so interesting. Please tell me more. Whereas when I talk to an American or European about it, they're like, oh, this is like clearly something for criminals. Like, I want to run away in the opposite direction. So actually, Bitcoin is much harder to promote in open societies than in closed ones for different reasons, at least from what I've seen. So with that, I mean, I think there's two factors that are going to lead to adoption in open societies. One is ultimately number go up, and the other one is going to be that the usability gets to the point where you'd prefer to use it than the existing system. And I think that is possible. Like you could have, if there's like Square integration with Lightning that works really well in the next 5 years, small merchants, if you go buy coffee, they might want to use that for different reasons, for both financial reasons and for privacy reasons, etc. So it'd have to be literally better than the existing system. But I think the main thing that'll force adoption is just number go up over time.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you, Matt. Let's move on to Hans.
Hans?
Yes, no? Okay, I guess not. Alex?
Hey, hello.
Yep.
Hey.
We're here. Yeah, thanks for the talk, and the talk can make me feel very uncomfortable about the world we live in.
Sorry.
My question, I guess, I don't know if it's even relevant anymore, but you guys were talking about a censorship-resistant and private dollar. I could see how a private dollar could exist. I could imagine that how it would make sense. But censorship resistance, how could it? Because it's a dollar, as in the US dollar, as in by the US government, as in something has to be redeemed at some point, or it has to touch back the US government, which they're against that because it's theirs, hence the name of the US dollar. So how can that conceptually even like make any sense, right? We're like,
Yeah. So
Can
paper
you guys
money
clarify
is right. So paper money obviously censorship resistant. Well, remember, we're never using the word censorship proof. We're using the word censorship resistant here. So obviously, I can go meet up with Udi and pay him, and yeah, if the government's watching us, they could 5 minutes later go and tackle him and take the money back. I mean, that would be breaking that would be censorship, right? So generally speaking, though, paper money, metal money is censorship resistant. So that's my question to people who are going to lobby the U.S. government to create quote unquote censorship resistant anonymous US dollars in a checking account that you would have with the Treasury. Is this a real idea that's being seriously discussed in the United States? I don't know how it works is the problem technically. I mean, Udi, you have more of a technical mind. How would a government accomplish that? Let's say if they wanted to. I don't think they're going to want to, but let's say they did want to. How could they do that for like small increments of money for citizens, giving them private kind of checking accounts?
I mean, I guess that's kind of the thing that I don't exactly see how they're going to do. I mean, it seems like there has to be some central authority. They could do it privately. They could, if they wanted to. Anyway, we know how to do those things privately. We knew since DigiCash how to do those things privately. So we could. The thing is that it seems like the issuers usually don't want to, but they could. They don't need blockchains for that, or Ethereum, or whatever. That's my view. So
the one guy gave me an example where he said, imagine you walk into a bank with like $10,000 and you ask the bank to enlarge denomination notes, and then you ask the bank to break those notes up into little ones, and you pay someone standing next to you with some of the little ones. The bank has done a service for you, but has no clue who you are, and privacy is being retained. So that's kind of the idea they're pushing, is you could kind of use a system like that, where they'd act as a clearinghouse, but wouldn't know who's getting what. I just doubt that they're going to be willing to do that. What would be the incentive of the U.S. government to not want to know what people are doing? Would be my question to those folks. But hey, if they can force the U.S. government to do it, and it's technically possible, obviously that would be a good thing. I would remain skeptical, and that's why I'm such a fan of Bitcoin. Is like, we don't need to ask permission,
Right. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yep. Agreed. Thanks, Alex. And for the last one, let's go to JC. JC, go ahead.
Hey, Alex. This was a great conversation today.
Thank you.
I'm really glad to hear that you have been playing with Lightning some. That's probably like 95% of my Bitcoin transactions now. I've yet to see anything specifically privacy focused on Lightning yet, but I've been hearing talks, and I just feel like when we start seeing Lightning wallets that are using Lightning channels with the implicit goal of privacy for on-chain Bitcoin, the possibilities are really endless there, and I feel like that's the sky's the limit on that. Also, I saw recently there's a new platform, LN Markets. It's like futures trading with Lightning. There was a person that was essentially talking about creating a stable platform, if you want to call it. It's not a stable coin, but essentially, taking a long and short position that counter each other out so that you can peg your Bitcoins to the current dollar value that way on the Lightning network, and have the same kind of benefit as a stablecoin would. In that sense, yeah, you're trusting an exchange, but that is a step towards, if you're going to trust, oracles or whatever anyway, that's a step towards being able to use Bitcoin and Lightning in a way that you don't have to worry about necessarily volatility with your local currency. I just wanted to add to that, and I hope that you continue to look into the Lightning ecosystem. It's a lot more mature than people realize. So much of the stuff is so cutting edge. You just have to find it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what Udi's take is on this, but for me, Lightning is very promising, but very difficult to use. I mean, when I made a transaction recently, I have this software called MyNode, which is really fun, and I have Lightning on there, and then I have a Zap wallet which is connected to my full node, and it's just not easy because, like, if you want to pay for something, you have to figure out how big of a channel you need, and there's just like a lot of work that needs to go into buying something right now.
The mobile
You know,
where the UX is for like somebody who wants, easy. So if you use Phoenix Wallet, for example, or Breeze Wallet, as soon as you
Yeah,
open the
I
wallet,
just-
you have a channel on your phone.
I know, but like, I feel like compromising on the decentralization piece is not worth it for me. So I like any sort of custodial anything. I just feel like pointless.
Non-custodial wallets that I just mentioned. And now,
Yeah.
Phoenix, you do sacrifice a little privacy. With Breeze, you don't. Completely non-custodial. Only you hold your keys. There's a node on your phone, and of course, the Bitcoin Lightning Wallet is another that's even more freeing, I guess, than Breeze, because you've got more freedom to just connect to whatever channel you want. But yeah, I just wanted to mention those things. I think there's a lot happening that isn't necessarily obvious because it's moving so fast right now.
Yeah.
I would
I'm
maybe
very
jump in there.
optimistic. Go ahead, Udi. I just feel like it's very early. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. I mean, I think like the analogy you gave about PGP to Signal, we're starting to see those new mobile Lightning wallets that have like pretty good UX. You don't have to think about channels. You don't have to think about all those stuff. It seems like the trade-off right now is somewhat to to having less privacy on those, unfortunately, at this stage. Not all of them. I think, as JC mentioned, some of them are better than the others, but generally, like if you want the ultimate privacy, you're probably going to want to run your own node at home and connect to that remotely, which is a chore, as you said.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing. And yeah.
Yeah. But hopefully, those two worlds can,
Yeah, and I think
eventually.
actually I think the concluding note here, maybe you'll agree, is that what we're going for is literally PGP, pretty good privacy, where you can't have perfect privacy. Perfect privacy with money means that we've made trade-offs in areas that I think Bitcoiners don't want to make trade-offs in. So I think we just want to get pretty good privacy, and I think we're on the way. So hopefully we can end optimistically that there are things happening that seem very bad for people who want to spy on us. Very bad developments are happening for people who want to be, Big Brother, who want to be like these guys and know everything about what we're doing. There are some very bad developments happening for them. So that's an exciting way to end, I guess.
Right. Yeah, that's a great way to end it. Absolutely.
Sorry, folks.
I wonder if they're listening.
Sorry.
They probably are listening, right?
Too bad. Yeah. Well, they can't take your Bitcoin, buddy. So.
Yeah. Awesome. So really, thank you, Alex, for this. This was
this
awesome.
was a lot of fun.
I really enjoyed this
Thank
talk.
you very much.
Thanks for joining us.
Okay, see you guys. See you on Twitter and elsewhere. And special thanks, Eric, for popping in with his very good question.